When is the right time to sell a stock? How do you protect against inflation? Financial decisions can be tricky, and often your own cognitive and emotional biases can lead you astray. Financial Decoder, an original podcast from Charles Schwab, can help. Join host Mark Reby as he offers practical solutions to help overcome the cognitive and emotional biases that may affect your investing decisions. Listen at schwab.com/financial decoder.
Weight loss. It needs to be fast and sustainable. Noom GLP-1 starts at just $149 and ships to your door in 7 days. Take it from Lauren, who lost 22 pounds on Noom.
If I come off of the GLP-1, it's not going to automatically make my weight yo-yo back.
$149 GLP-1s? Now that's Noom smart. Get started at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. Individual results may vary. Not all customers will medically qualify for prescription medications. Compounded medications are not reviewed by the FDA for safety, efficacy, or quality.
You know, it's really interesting because up until my dad has been gone 39 years, which is shocking to me. I mean, it's just crazy. However, you know, for police officers, they have end of watch websites and people still send messages. 39 years later, people still recognize the anniversary. People still, send messages. And for me, I feel so grateful. I feel grateful that my dad made that kind of impression. He made that kind of dent in this world, right? And so I think, just acknowledging that person, and it just really does. I feel grateful and I feel proud, and it's really important. I mean, the whole reason why I wrote the book, one of the reasons I wrote the book, is because I spent many, many years with people telling my story in their head, right? How I should react, what I should think, how they would have handled it if it was me, if it was them, right? And a lot of times it was this picture of someone that I was not. And so at the time, when I knew that my mental health was healthy enough where I would be able to go down this journey, and that was at 50 years old, by the way, I drew a line in the sand and I said, this is it. I need to tell my story. And as scary as the things that I'm going to talk about are, I've got to do it because it's time. It's time for people to understand that. Plus, I'm a mom and I wanted to change the legacy for my children.
That's Susan Snow, whose father, a detective at the LAPD, was killed in the 1980s and the author of the book, The Other Side of the Gun. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Susan Snow remembers the day that her father, a detective for the Los Angeles Police Department, was ambushed and shot in front of her brother's school. It was Halloween, 1985. That day, as he was picking up his 6-year-old son at a church daycare center, Detective Thomas Charles Williams, who was 42 years old and had 13 years on the force, was ambushed and assassinated in order to prevent him from testifying in a robbery trial. Masked gunmen opened up with a MAC-10 machine gun, killing him. The police chief at the time, Daryl Gates, said that an officer had never been killed in such a fashion in the history of the LAPD. That tragic event set the stage for Susan's lifelong struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that went undiagnosed for years. She and those around her misunderstood the anxiety, the nightmares, the flashbacks that haunted her life creating a greater sense of isolation for her. Then, after hearing about a school shooting, it clicked, and Susan began, through therapy, unpacking the layers and layers of complex and compounded grief and trauma in her life. She focused on building coping mechanisms like using mindfulness and self-care practices that helped her regain control of her life for the first time since her father was killed when she was only 17. When her father died, Susan was thrust into the spotlight as a victim's family member. Her life was completely altered at the time. Now Susan is focused on building awareness about mental health issues and using her own struggle to help others who are struggling. Through it all, Susan has found strength in her vulnerability and peace in her grief, something that never leaves you but can walk beside you instead of weighing you down. Today, Susan and I are going to talk about loss, and we're going to talk about being in the spotlight, what it's like to be the center of attention when a crime happens that captures the nation's imagination. We're going to talk about how to find hope and healing and the importance of vulnerability, both to your own progress and to showing other people a way that they can get better. So, Susan, I just wanted to thank you for coming on. I really appreciate, and people who know me will tell you, one of the things that I appreciate the most are people who are willing to be vulnerable about things. It's, in my mind, it's hard enough to even tackle some of the challenges that we have, based on our life experiences or our personalities or whatever's going on. It's hard to tackle those challenges. It's a lot harder to give people a window into them. And so I appreciate you doing this and being willing to be vulnerable, writing your book, advocating for people and for awareness, because I know as much as it takes a lot of strength to address our own challenges, it also takes something special to show it to the world, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I one of the things I wanted to start by asking you, because I think sometimes when we have conversations like these, we'll often start at the event, right? The big event. But I'm just curious, what was your life like? You wrote your book, and it's a great book. And one of the things that I think for me, in telling people stories, we often start with the big event in life, but we never talk about what it was like before. So I'm just curious about what it was like, growing up with your mom, your dad, your brother, and, what everything was like before that fateful day.
Oh, well, I had a pretty normal life as far as I was 17 when it happened, and it was a pretty normal life. My dad and I had a very close relationship. To give you an idea of what he was like, he was a very present person. So no matter who you were, whether you were someone who worked with him or you were his spouse or his child, he always was very present, and he didn't allow other things to distract him. So he always made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. And I've heard that from people that have worked with him, that have trained with him, that were friends with him over the years. And but he was also, he was my sense of security. And when I was younger, he was a street cop, and I was much younger. So I understood that dad could get hurt on the job. You know, Anything worse than that didn't even come into my mind. But as I got older, and he became a detective, I had this false sense of security with him because I figured, he was a desk job guy, right? And he came in and investigated after the crime was committed. So therefore, he would never be in danger. And
Yeah, because the common ways we hear about police officers ending up in danger are, vehicular accidents, where somebody either hits them or hits their car or hits them while they're walking out, or, responding to some active incident. And it's almost like, I imagine like a lot of spouses breathe a sigh of relief when their police officer, husband or wife becomes a detective or a supervisor.
yeah, I mean, it's just, you just know that they've got a desk job now. And he was also kind of he was my voice of reason. And, my mom and I, we didn't have the greatest of relationships, really struggled. And it's taken me many, many years to say this. But we really struggled. And my dad was always the go-between, And so I had that. He was just, he was there for me. He was security for me. He was present for me. And I loved my dad. I really loved him for who he was.
I love that. I remember this story that I heard a long time. Well, no, it wasn't a story. It was actually in a book. And it was by Jamie Dimon, who's now I can't believe he's still the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. And he was writing about like his children and raising his children and always being worried that he wasn't spending enough time with them.
Mm-hmm.
And when they got older, they told him, Dad, you were always there. And like he knew in his brain, no, I wasn't always there. Like I missed these things. And his kid said to him, no, when you were with us, you were with us.
Mm-hmm.
You were totally present when you were with us. And as you were saying that, I was thinking about like what an important quality that is in a parent. But I could also see why that would make a great quality for a police officer too, right?
Yeah.
Like being able to focus on people and listen to them. And
Yep.
it just de-escalates so much. And it also probably helped him be a better investigator and a better father and all sorts of things.
Absolutely. And that was one of the things, the stories that I hear and everything from people that had worked with him and stuff. And they referred to him as the cop's cop. Very straight-laced, very straightforward, didn't put up with a whole lot of baloney. And he was like that with me as well. Like, growing up with him, he told me as I got older, if you do anything illegal, I will personally book you myself. Like it was just,
He's like, see these handcuffs?
Yeah. They will go on you.
We make them for kids.
Yes. So, I knew that I was never going to be able to get away with a whole lot as a kid. And also being, raised up by a police officer, you have to grow a little bit of a thick skin as a child because you're hearing all the, derogatory names for police officers and people joking about them and things like that. And I had to I just had to learn to ignore it or, laugh it off or tune it out or whatever. But I always knew that my dad was one of the good ones, and so he didn't deserve to be called the derogatory names. And most people did not call him by, bad names or whatever. They were very respectful of my dad.
Yeah.
And, I'm grateful for that.
See, one of the things that really sort of like struck me about in reading The Other Side of the Gun and also, I looked up a bunch of old articles on, your father's case and situation. I hate to even use that word to call it a case, but about your dad.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that, like, it just sort of the image stuck in my head was this idea of your dad going to the church daycare center to pick up your 6-year-old brother.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought to myself, like, you don't accidentally find someone at a church daycare center. Like, you plan this out and you follow them.
Mm-hmm.
And it was this contrast, this juxtaposition in my head of this man doing this lovely thing of picking up his 6-year-old son from daycare and this horrible thing just looming,
Yeah.
right beside him. What was it? What was it like that day? Do you remember how you found out even? Or
Oh, well, I can tell you. Okay, so it was Halloween night, and that morning, my mom had already left to go to work. She had dressed up for a costume contest at work, and she left early. And my dad was, getting ready for his day, and he was testifying that day. He was the lead detective on this case that he was testifying on. And he was not acting normal. Like, my dad never got really nervous before he went to court, but this particular day, he was a little on edge. And of course, he was a little on edge, and his teenage daughter decided it was a perfect idea to ask him to go to a party on a school night with her boyfriend and friends.
what teenage daughter on Halloween wouldn't want to go to a party at a
Right.
school?
And so I helped him. Like, he wasn't a fashionista by any means. And so he needed a little help figuring out what tie went with what suit and that kind of thing. And I thought, well, if I do this, then, I'll break him down. He'll let go. And that didn't happen. He took me to school that day, and I just planned the whole day that I was going to go home. I was going to, clean the whole house and show my parents, how responsible I am and that they need to let me out on a school night to go to this party. The plan all along was that, my dad would leave work and go pick up my brother from school, and then he would come home. My mom would be home from work, and then we would figure out the night from there. What ended up happening is I was home. My mom got home, and she went to go take her costume off, and I was proceeding to get my costume on, and the phone rang, and I sprinted across the room because this was when phones were connected to a wall.
Oh, yes. I remember the days.
And this was 85. So
Mhm.
I picked up the phone thinking it was one of my girlfriends, and it was not. It was a lady at my brother's school. And all she said was that there was a drive-by shooting and my dad was involved. And I saw my mom come around the corner, and I just handed her the phone as fast as I could. And I watched her demeanor. I watched her body language. And I was trying to listen in on the conversation. I really couldn't, but I could tell by just looking at my mom that it was bad. She got off the phone and looked at me and said, "We're going to the school." So we got in the car and we drove the 7 minutes to the school and didn't speak to each other the whole entire time there. And as I was sitting in the chair, I was just like really trying to figure out, like, how bad is this going to be? I was scared. I was terrified. And I just kind of, like, at that point was just rolling with the punches kind of thing. I was just going along. And the way that the school was set up was, you're at the front of the school. In the middle of the school, there's a parking lot. And the back of the school is where they let out the kids in after school care. And so when we parked in the middle parking lot, we started heading towards the back of the school. And all we could see was, because it was dark by then, And you could see the lights of the police units and an ambulance in the sky. Like it just lit up the entire sky. And we saw two officers walking towards us, and they had tears in their eyes. And we just kind of ignored it and kept going. And both of us saw my dad's truck. So we started to run towards the truck. And as we got close to the truck, we saw glass on the ground. When we rounded the corner, that's where he was. And they had partially covered him up. They were still in the investigation stages. And at that point, my mom, she dropped to her knees and started screaming. And being a kid, I could not comprehend what I was seeing. And what I ended up doing is hyper focusing on the ambulance and saying to myself, why aren't they helping him? Why isn't anyone helping him? And soon enough, two officers kind of grabbed both of us and escorted us out of the area. And we went to an office inside of the school. And I sat down immediately, and my mom got taken aside by some detectives. At this point, I had no idea where my brother was. I didn't know if he was hurt, nothing. And as I was sitting there, I was just trying to wrap my head around what was happening. I heard two women speaking in the office, and they worked there. And the one woman said that, Mr. Williams is deceased. At that point, my world cracked. My sky cracked. I was just like in such shock of hearing those words that I just wanted to run out of that room as far as I could go. But my legs felt like cement and I couldn't move. Physically, I could not move. And a little bit later, my mom came up to me and she said, I'm sending you with a neighbor. And it was really hard because even though I wanted to run out of that room and run away, I still felt the need to be around my family and to be with my family unit.
Yeah,
And
there's
I didn't
there's
get
this
that.
yeah, there's this picture in one of the it may have no, I think it was a wire photo from the Associated Press, and it was early November. I think it was maybe November 6th. No, or maybe November 5th, something like that. But it was the day of the funeral. And there's this picture of you, your brother, and your mom, and your brother, this little guy with his hand in his eyes, very crying, and your head bowed. I could tell your mom like focused forward, but I looked down at the picture and I saw like the intensity of the two of you holding each other's hands. And I mean, the picture alone almost brought me to tears.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
You need each other.
Yeah. And unfortunately, and don't get me wrong, like that night was so chaotic. It was so chaotic. There was so much going on. There were so many things going on. And I don't blame her, but at the same time, what that did for me is it literally made me feel like I was not important in that scenario. And I still didn't know what I still didn't know, like, what my brother had seen or what he'd gone through. And
But you knew he was okay at that
I
point.
knew he was okay, but not until the day later. I just,
Oh, wow.
I went to the neighbor's house. I did. And unfortunately, this neighbor knew my parents for years and years. And so she was trying to wrap her head around what was happening. And, her grief. And here she has, his daughter in her home. Like I was inconsolable. Like, she tried, but I was inconsolable. And all I wanted at that point was my boyfriend. And she did call him. She called my boyfriend at work, and he's a couple years older than me. And she didn't give him a lot of information. So when he came to the house, his mindset was that he was going to take me to a hospital somewhere. And as I stood on the porch and he was asking me,
Was that
what hospital?
he was thinking what hospital your dad was at?
Yeah.
Or, okay.
Yeah. He's like, where's your mom? Where's your brother? What hospital did they take him to? Let's go, grab your coat, let's go. And I could not spit the words out. I could not say it. And it wasn't until he was continuing to be, let's go kind of thing, I just blurted it out. He's not there. He's gone. And my boyfriend was like, what do you mean he's gone? And I said, he's gone. He's not at a hospital. And I mean, we had only been dating 3 months, and he was 19 years old at the time. And he just collapsed, fell to his knees, and we both just lost it, and we were kids. So we had no way of navigating this. Like we didn't know how to process this, and we didn't know how to navigate this. And, he stayed with me that night. When I decided that I was going to go home, I didn't recognize my own neighborhood. By this time, it was filled with police officers, and we had helicopters overhead. We had police officers. My house was filled with people I'd never seen before.
They were still looking for the suspects.
Yeah.
I remember when I was reading about it, one of the things that the police chief, who was Daryl Gates at the time, that he said, he said a number of very lovely things about your father, but he also said no one in this police department has ever been killed in this fashion.
Right.
That it was a shock to the entire system.
It absolutely
the whole fraternity.
Was.
Yeah.
Yep. It absolutely was. It was the first time an officer had been assassinated in LAPD, in the annals of LAPD. And unbeknownst to us at the time, we did not know that we were also a target. So that's why we had so much police presence. And it took them a good 6 days to find him and, take him into custody.
Why were you all a target? Were there? My understanding is that the ultimate story was that, or at least they believe that someone put a hit out on him for $10,000, which, like, even inflation adjusted, seems like a crazy low amount of money to try and kill a police officer.
Yeah, it was planned out for months. We were all followed. My dad's murder case, it's so convoluted. There's so much to it. And,
that must have been very hard to even think about, like that idea that for all this time, I've been being followed too.
Oh, absolutely. That didn't come out until the trial. And we had 2 of them. The reason we had 2 trials is because we had so many defendants. There were 6 men that were tried, and 3 of them were convicted. And so we had to go through 2 trials. And when we went through the trial, they had photographs, and they had photographs of my childhood home. And my boyfriend's car was in the front of the house. So he too was in danger. We didn't know that at the time. And just knowing that they had stalked us for months was very unnerving. I don't know if my mom knew that we were targets. She might have. I did not know until the trial came out. So all I know is that for 6 days, I woke up well, I didn't even wake up because I didn't sleep. I would just look out my window and I would see, police officers in my front yard, in my backyard. I had bodyguards. Anytime we had to go anywhere, we had bodyguards. And not only was, extreme police present, but the media set up camp in our neighborhood.
What was that? It's a question that I wish I could ask so many people. I'm just so curious about what it is like in that moment to have your world change because of, a giant loss like that, but also everything else. Like, no one prepares anyone for that kind of media attention. No one prepares, anyone really to have to change your life and your life become like the Secret Service is following you around everywhere. Like, it must have created a lot of anxiety too, on top of the grief.
Yeah, I was already anxious. I was already anxious, and what I can say about my mindset back then was I was living in a fog, and I was very subservient. So if someone told me to go a certain way, that's the way I would go, right? You just pushed me in a direction, and that's the direction I would go.
Yep. Tell me to go left.
Exactly. Okay. And so as far as the media, I think the only thing that was really difficult for me to process was the fact that I had no private grieving time. And that was hard. I had to grieve in public.
Right.
And so that, on top of the loss, on top of, the circumstances.
I do know exactly what you mean, in the sense that, like, when you're grieving a big loss, and I think my mom died in October of 2023. And one of the really interesting things about it for me is, like, grieving is nothing like I imagine it is, or losing a parent is like nothing I ever imagined. There's a sense of loneliness, right? Because this is not a replaceable person.
Right.
This is not, but I was allowed to grieve in whatever way I needed to, however absurd it was, whatever it was I needed to grieve. And there's this pressure, right? And I felt it for like a moment at my mom's funeral, and then I snapped out of it. This kind of pressure to conform to the expectations that other people have around you. And not until you just brought that up did I think how freeing it was for me to be able to grieve the way that I wanted to be. And I would have never really even imagined that for you, you're grieving on a public stage with expectations of you. And
yep, there was expectations of me. I was expected to keep my stuff together. And that was really hard. I mean, getting back to the very beginning of it, I mean, it took the media 3 days to figure out he had a teenage daughter. And the reason it is because all the focus obviously was on my brother. I mean, my dad saved his life, and he was 6 years old, so it really, all of that focus was on my mother and my brother. And right, so be it. I get that.
Because it didn't your dad, like, your brother had just reached the door of the pickup truck and your father yelled for him to duck.
Yes.
So your dad had this instance where he knew what was coming.
Yep, he did.
And instead of sort of doing whatever he needed to do to protect himself, he yelled for your brother to duck.
Exactly.
That's so powerful.
Yeah. So, and so again, with it started a pattern for me, because the night I was sent to a neighbor's house, then the police, then the media didn't even acknowledge me for 3 days. Um, and I felt like I was just in this like world of my own, and back then there was no talk about mental health. In the mid 80s, there were no resources, especially within LAPD at the time. There wasn't really a whole lot of resources for the kids.
Right.
And so basically all I had to rely on was the adults around me.
One of the things that your mom said afterwards really struck me. She said something along the lines of, and I think this was and I may butcher the quote, but it was in a story about your brother being at the soccer field, and it describes what you described, like plainclothes officers on guard,
Mhm.
because of what had happened, um, and, there's this poignant moment in it where they're talking about your brother's birthday party, and he got a new bike, other presidents, bunch of police officers came to it.
Mhm.
Um, and it talks about how in his religion class a few days before, he had been asked to draw a picture of a child, and he drew a picture of a boy standing beside a grave.
Mhm.
And that caught me. But the quote that your mom said in the story that ties back to what you were just saying, she said, we want him to get back to a normal life as soon as possible. And what caught me about that is it really reminds me, like in my family, when I look at my extended family, generation
Mhm.
two back, of the stoicism in
Mhm.
front of tragedy. Three of my nieces died or not my nieces, excuse me, my father's nieces died in a fire when they were young over the Christmas holidays,
Mm.
at the house. They never talked about them.
Mhm.
They never talked about them. Um, and and I understand that impulse to get things back to quote unquote normal, even though we
Mhm.
know there's never going to be a normal.
Right.
But do you think that there's an element to this where we need to kind of pause and assess for, you know, the family members and I think particularly when someone is taken from you,
Mhm.
because, I had the gift of being able to prepare for my mom's death,
Right.
right? That when someone is taken from you, do we need to like take a moment, take a beat to like think about our unconscious biases about what we think we'd want and really think about what the individual needs?
Yeah, I mean, I talk about this a lot. I'm a coach and I've coached people about grief and loss. And one of the things that I say is that one of the things that I keep from saying is I understand what you feel like because I lost somebody, right? But you don't. One, you didn't have the same relationship with that person
Mm-hmm.
that the person that is grieving and hurting did. So you have no way to know what that person is feeling like. For one, that's one. Um, I think the most important thing for someone who is grieving, and especially if it's a tragic situation, is it's important for them, because this is something that I did not get. Okay. It's important for them to know that you acknowledge their pain.
Mm.
That's that is the most important thing, that you acknowledge their pain.
It's interesting.
And
It's interesting.
and it doesn't happen a lot.
Yeah, well, because I think one of the things that I've noticed about big losses, and I would not just say that this is losses about death. This could be loss of a marriage.
Mhm.
Could be a loss. People don't know what to say,
Right.
and so they don't say anything.
Yep.
But it's almost better to say I don't know what to say
Exactly.
than to say nothing.
Exactly. Yes. Because you're acknowledging. You may not know what to say to that person, but you're acknowledging that they are in pain. And that's really important. And one of the things that I've learned many, many years, like it took me a long time. And what it did was I realized that the reason that I have had such a strained relationship with my mother is because she has narcissistic tendencies. And so she kind of turtles into herself and everybody is secondary, And
Mm-hmm.
so that pattern carried throughout the years. And what ended up
And
happening
I
is
imagine that actual tendency
Mhm.
would be complicated
It was.
by something like such a high profile
Oh, yeah.
murder,
Yep.
because you have all this media attention
Yep.
on you and your kids. And, I don't know if you feel this way, but certainly one of the things you mentioned, the thing that it took the media 3 days
Mm-hmm.
to mention you. And there's a very powerful narrative, like we were talking about in your brother's part of the story. He was there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't hear your mom talk about you.
I
The
know.
only evidence of you were the pictures of you.
I know.
How did that feel?
I can laugh at it now, but when you have, and this is like a whole different thing, but when you grow up with a narcissistic parent, that happens a lot. And so throughout my,
So you almost felt like with your brother, she was just latching. It wasn't so much about your brother, but she was latching on to
Yeah.
the talking about the child, which had the better narrative, which
Yes.
would get her more attention. Right?
Absolutely. And, she has lived in her victimhood since this happened. Like she lives in it, and I always had this weird sense of like, when I do things, nice things for people, I don't do them for accolades. I do them because that's just who I am. And I
You and
like
I are in the
help
same
other
boat,
people, right?
right? You and I are in the same boat.
She likes the accolades and she likes people to acknowledge her and it makes her more relevant. You know what I mean? And so, and
Literally,
that's just her
Susan,
choice, right? That's
I was having this conversation last week, literally, because I had made some donations to someone
Mhm.
who was really really suffering, and it's somebody who is going like single mom going through terrible breast cancer, and there was a
Mhm.
big issue related to it. And it was like a really emotional moment for me, and that happened in the story, and I held back telling my friends
Mhm.
about the donations or how I was feeling. And one of them asked, like, why didn't you tell me this? And I said, I don't want to come off like virtue signaling. Like, I do things for other people because I want them to feel better, not to make me look better.
right. Well,
And
and
it's
that's
really weird when you're with somebody who's different, at least for me.
it is hard. It does. It's taken me many, many years to get to this point where I can acknowledge that that's just who I am and there is no ego in that, right? For her, there's ego in it. And so there was always this, and I don't know, like, I'm not a therapist by any means. I'm just a coach. But when I recognized, you know, the relationship and the toxicity of the relationship, and I realized that there might be some jealousy there that I was able to heal. And, I always talk to her about her own healing and about therapy and finding a therapist and really, working on herself and, that kind of thing throughout the years. because I was doing it, and I felt this obligation as the oldest child, especially, that it was almost my responsibility to help her heal. And it's taken me many
Mm.
years to realize that it's not my job.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
hers.
Yep.
And I can heal myself and do, put boundaries down and do what's best for me. And she's got to do her,
You know
she
that
has to do that for
you know
herself.
that saying people have, which is like, it goes, don't make your problem my problem, right? Like, people say that.
Yep.
I find so often, though, like, that caring people, it's not that other people are always making it their problem, although that is a narcissist challenge,
Mhm.
but we often make other people's problems ours, right?
Mhm.
Like, and I'll take a simple example. Someone's mad at me, right? Like, I'll do whatever it is to try and fix it or figure out what's going on. And I've
Mhm.
learned over time, like, if you're mad at me and you don't bring it up to me, that's not my problem. That's your
Right.
problem.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. And that's all healing, that's all coming from healing as well. And like I said, it's taken me many, many years. And I really struggled. I mean, in the very beginning, I didn't even know what therapy was. Like, I thought, at 17, I thought therapy was like people were nuts. Like, you were crazy. If you had to see a therapist, you were crazy, right? That was just my mindset. And it's because of things that I heard, and the programming I had and that kind of thing. And when LAPD came to us about a month after my dad was killed, and they said, we want to pay for a therapist for all three of you, separate
Mm.
therapy. And my mom said, you're going to do this kind of thing. And I said, okay, because like I said, you put me in a direction, and that's where I went. And I saw this man.
And that's a shock response, right? I mean,
It
not
was
everyone
for
has
sure.
that, but yeah.
Absolutely. It was a trauma response for sure.
Yep. I
Um,
I I was at, so I covered, as a reporter, I covered 9/11,
mhm,
and, I mental health issues coming out of that, already had, like, undiagnosed bipolar disorder, an assortment of different things, right? Like, I was a recovering alcoholic and only, like, 6 months into that recovery, and I kind of, like, not kind of, I became, like, super psychotic. And
mhm,
so I'm reporting and anxious and agoraphobic and, like, having all these weird symptoms, but because I was a recovering alcoholic and the newspaper I worked for had helped me
mhm,
during that time, my young self thought, like, well, there's no such thing as another chance. And, that led to, for me, me committing these giant acts of, like, fabrication, plagiarism. It became a giant scandal. But
mhm,
one really interesting thing about it, right? Like, it shocked my system,
mhm,
but, and I feel like it humbled me. But, but one thing that happened on day one of that breaking was I went from being, and I think it truly shocked me. Like, there were other traumas, but that was a trauma into itself, even though I was responsible for it. Because it was all over the, like, national newspapers, international, and TV. But one thing that I remember from that so crystal clear, on the second day or the day after, or the day before, if you had told me to do something, I definitely wouldn't have done it, whatever it was, because I was not going to be told what to do. That was my
mhm,
personality. The day after, you could have told me that what I needed to do is walk into the East River, and I would have walked right into the East River. And
mhm.
it's so interesting how trauma can just instantly change you.
Oh, absolutely. And I had been dealing with, at the time, unbeknownst to me, I had been dealing with severe depression. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't sleep at night. So I was like a zombie. And I had anxiety through the roof, and no way and no tools to regulate my nervous system. And so when I went to this therapist, I thought, okay, he's a professional. He's going to help me. And, he's going to help me feel better. But unfortunately, and I talk about this a lot, at the time, I don't believe that this gentleman was trauma competent. And so he really didn't want to dive in. He never, ever, and the whole entire time that I saw him, asked me how that night affected me. And I know that sounds crazy, but I honestly feel like he was afraid to even go there because then he, what would he do kind of thing.
Well, yeah. And I also think like in the past 20 years, we've probably gained a
Oh, gosh,
much better understanding of like
Absolutely.
complex post-traumatic stress disorder when you're,
Yeah.
when you're experiencing, because you didn't really experience one trauma, because I would say you grew up with a narcissistic family.
Oh, I had multiple traumas.
Well, but like it's
Yeah.
easy for people to look at it
Yeah.
as like the death of your dad is the only trauma there, but like the media, the the things you were mentioning with your mom,
Yeah.
the having to have people follow you around, the first day that you have to go back to school, they're all these traumas and they become like, they become so intertwined. And we know now that like psychotherapy can be beneficial for them. But I think 20 years ago or more, we had a real hard time understanding that, like trauma is not about getting over one event.
Right.
Right. It's this very complex interconnections between things. And I think what people really didn't understand at the time, PTSD compared to a complex PTSD, was that with complex PTSD, you're more likely to struggle with emotional regulation and relationships and even your like identity and sense of self. And then when you layer that on top of the anxiety that normally comes in PTSD or the flashback and the nightmares, it's even harder. I've always said mental illness is like the one disease, although diabetes might fit in this category too, the one disease, because it's operating in your mind, that actively works against you getting help.
Yeah.
And so like all those things, like the heightened emotional responses, the impulsivity thrown on with the emotional regulation is just very difficult to understand. And I think you're making I think a very important point here, that for people, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, I really believe that for people who are looking for help related to a trauma, and heck, even some people who aren't looking for trauma help may not even realize they've experienced trauma.
Yep.
Introduce man on the other side of this call who would have sworn to you for like half a decade that seeing 9/11 was not, and it's the craziest thing too, because the story that I have of that day of like going into Manhattan as everyone was going out, 20 years later, my best friend, who's a reporter, wrote this magazine article about 9/11 and what happened on the day. And I read it and I said, wow, this is really powerful. I know I wasn't with you during this part of it because we had been there for part of the day. And he was like, what are you talking about? You were with me the whole day. I was like, no. I didn't go straight down to the World Trade Center that night. I had wiped out like 6 hours, including 6 of the toughest hours, because I was like, I swear we met up later. And he said to me, how would we meet? Cell phones weren't working.
Right.
But the point I get at this, right, is that I think it's so important to make sure the therapists you're working with is trauma informed.
Oh, it's trauma competent, really. So this guy, I saw him for a year. And every single session I saw him every week, all he would want to talk about is my relationship with my mother, my boyfriend, my brother, and school. And that's it. And
I feel like
every
there's
week,
a real obvious one missing there.
I was like, today's the day, right? And an entire year went by, and I went in one day and he said, Susan, you're a well-rounded young lady. You're going to be fine for the rest of your life, and I don't need to see you anymore. And I left that office thinking, oh my God, I've snapped. I'm crazy. This is what I'm going to live with for the rest of my life. I better just get used to it. Even a professional can't help me. And I literally lived in fight or flight for 14 years of my life.
Wow.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you, like, just in thinking about it, like, what advice, and I know you coach and you help people who have experienced these kinds of things, but what advice would you have for therapists and coaches who are operating in the mental health space when it comes to people who are like you?
I talk about this a lot. I think when I say trauma competent, there are so many different types of trauma, right? And I feel like if you are dealing, let's say, sex assault, okay? If you're going to someone who deals with that type of trauma, they are going to be more apt. And what I find too is a lot of therapists have had that particular experience, so they can understand where you're coming from. For one, they're educated in that type of trauma, and they're able to give you the right modalities for whatever it is that you're dealing with, right? I think in the mental health world, I see this a lot, is there's a generalization that happens. So I think what happens is, because it's a generalization, people will go to a therapist and there's no connection there. There's no vulnerability there. There's no feel of being safe with that particular person. And I tell people the only way that you're going to heal is if you allow yourself to be vulnerable. But in order for someone to be vulnerable, they need to feel like they have a safe space.
Right. And that's why I tell people, because one of the challenges is that, like, when you go into therapy for the first time, you have no idea what to expect, or, and you, just like you did, like, you assume that what the therapist is doing is right. But I always tell people, like, you have to develop a relationship where you feel safe with your therapist. So if you have to plow through 7 therapists in 7 weeks to find the right one,
right,
like, do it.
I do the same thing. I say the same thing. I think it's really important. If anything that I say, I think the most important thing is to realize that this is your healing. It's not theirs. And you are putting in, you're investing in your own journey and your own healing journey. And so in doing that, like, interview your therapist. Make sure that they're able to handle your type of trauma or whatever it is that you're going through. It's your healing. And I think that's super important for people to realize that they are the ones that have the control. If you are able to go out and really find that you need to heal from something, you're taking your power back. And in doing that, you have to, like, interview your therapist, making sure that you're working with the right people that are going to allow you to, are going to come alongside your journey and help you and guide you in the right way.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the therapist is bad, and you're
No.
not sending the message to the therapist that they're bad.
No.
It's just that they may not be the right person for you. I remember this moment for me in my mental health journey where my therapist turned to me and said something. I forget what I said that provoked this, but he's like, "Don't you realize you're in the driver's seat?" And it was like this big revelation. Oh yeah, I am driving this therapy train. And I was joking with my own therapist last week in my appointment, because I came in with this big question, right? And I started talking about it. And then, like, 40 minutes later of me talking, she's like, "Thank you for solving it yourself."
Yeah.
I was like, and that's the beauty. You just need the space where you can be vulnerable. And that's part of why I think vulnerability is so powerful. I was going to ask you, another question because I was thinking about what you had said earlier about like the media, the officers around.
Mhm.
And, like we have this giant kind of like true crime documentaries now and all
Mhm.
sorts of other things. And your dad's case was a huge case. So in a lot of ways, it parallels, even though we didn't have the internet, it parallels a lot of these things. Like, what advice would you have for those of us who are like in the media or those of us who are like true crime fans or enthusiasts who like as as a young girl who's going through that, like we constantly see these cases. I don't know if you ever heard the case of Maura Murray, who disappeared in New Hampshire. And,
Mhm.
I've talked to her sister, Julie, and one of the things she said to me is like, never give up hope, but
Mhm.
engage people with empathy. And there was this recent trial in Delphi, Indiana, where I so admire the sister of one of the victims, but I just think, what must it be like to try to be in the spotlight like this
Mhm.
at this moment? And I think my understanding that you don't get over grief, and I picked that up after my mom's loss, that you live with grief.
Mhm.
I, d- I-
You live with PTSD too, and
yeah,
you learn to manage it.
yeah.
That was the one thing when I did find my therapist, the right one. That was one of the things she said to me. You know, she
You
said
don't get over
I
it.
had PTSD, and I had no idea. I had no idea, and I kept thinking, "Well, gosh, I didn't go to war. What are you talking about?" And
Yes.
she goes, "No, anyone who experiences a traumatic event in their life can have PTSD, but what you need to understand is that PTSD does not go away. You learn to manage it."
You walk with it as opposed
And
to
that
it
gives me
walking on
hope.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And because I always think about it like, do you want this to walk on you or
Yeah.
walk with it? But like, what
But
can
as far
we,
as like being in the limelight or,
yeah.
being out there or whatever, it's funny you would bring this up because there was a TV movie made about my dad.
Oh, wow.
And it was there used to be an In the Line of Duty series, speaking of true crime, in the 90s. And my dad's story was called The Price of Vengeance. And I was a creative consultant on the movie.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
it didn't have a lot of say. My mom took that over. Um, and what I can say to you about that is I have a love-hate relationship with that movie. And the reason I do is because I feel like there was a lot of Hollywood, and I get it. They have to embellish and they have to be PC and they have to do all of those things, but I I wish that they had played us real. Like, our
Mm.
characters real. Like, don't make up some fantasy world of what that experience was.
That's interesting. I wonder whether like part of it is we as people in general, and this probably applies to the therapist too, but like thinking about like the media and spaces like true crime, like we turn people like real people, and real people are messy, right?
Mhm.
Inconsistent, messy, and all sorts of other things, but we turn them into characters for a screenplay. And you need
Mhm.
to behave in these models of the screenplay, and this is like, you're the good guy, you're this, you're that. And I wonder whether like we need to like realize that people are not like a screenplay or a narrative podcast. They're
Mhm.
people with all their messiness, and they should be allowed to have all their messiness. And we should
Right.
educate people about that.
Exactly. And it was I felt like it was very surreal. I got to tell you, it was very very surreal to be on set and see the things that I saw being filmed and hearing my name and hearing my mom's name and hearing my dad's name and they're actors, right? And so it was a little nuts. And at the same time, it was surreal, right? It was never in a million years did I think something like that would ever happen. And here it was, right? And it was, when I screened it, you'll kind of get it. Well, you may giggle over this one because I told you the whole leaving me out thing has been a pattern in my life, not anymore, but in the past. And we screened it. It was right after the 94 earthquake in Northridge. We screened it in Hollywood and watched the whole entire movie. And at the end, if you know made for TV movies, they usually put what the real people are doing, right? What they've been up to. So they talked about my mom and they talked about my brother and they talked about the main character, the guy who killed my dad. And they didn't mention me one iota.
Oh, wow.
It was like I dropped off the earth, right?
Wow.
And I had gotten married. I had my first child. Like there was a lot. And afterwards, of course, I was upset and I called the production company and I said, "Hey, what about me? Hello?" And they said, "Oh, we can't do the editing, no more editing. So will you just take your name and credits?" And I was like, "Okay."
Wow. So it's kind of like in this true crime story, they erased you from your
Pretty much.
father's life.
I mean, he was a main character through the whole movie, but at the end, it was like, oh, what? I mean, and my phone when it was actually on TV, I think it was like ABC or NBC or whatever, maybe it was NBC, and my phone was blowing up because people that knew me were like, "Hey, what happened to you?"
Yeah.
I mean, I know what happened to you, but what happened to you? And I was like, yeah. Sorry about
I
that.
wonder about that too. Like, and I know they mentioned your brother, they mentioned your mom, but I think about it, like you're talking probably almost a decade after your father died.
Mhm.
Um, like how do we, right? Like, okay, whether we're the media or whether we're like the true crime fans or whoever,
Mhm.
like we're in your life, right? We have expectations and we're in your business, which we probably shouldn't have, right? but so like, is there a way for us like to not forget and to not let you go when it's 10 years or when the case is done? Is there something that we can do for you all that goes beyond?
It's really interesting because up until my dad has been gone 39 years, which is shocking to me. I mean, it's just crazy. However, for police officers, they have end of watch websites and people still send messages 39 years later. People still recognize the anniversary. People still, send messages. And for me, I feel so grateful. I feel grateful that my dad made that kind of impression. He made that kind of dent in this world, right? And so I think, just acknowledging that person, and it just really does. I feel grateful and I feel proud, and it's really important. I mean, the whole reason why I wrote the book, one of the reasons I wrote the book is because I spent many, many years with people telling my story in their head, right? How I should react, what I should think, how they would have handled it if it was me, if it was them, right? And a lot of times it was this picture of someone that I was not. And so at the time, when I knew that my mental health was healthy enough where I would be able to go down this journey, and that was at 50 years old, by the way, I drew a line in the sand and I said, this is it. I need to tell my story. And as scary as the things that I'm going to talk about are, I've got to do it because it's time. It's time for people to understand that. Plus, I'm a mom and I wanted to change the legacy for my children. My legacy with my dad is dark, right? It's dark and it's there was a lot of pain and a lot of things attached to it. And for my kids, I didn't want that. I wanted them to see me rise up from the ashes, right?
And give them hope.
Absolutely.
Right? That when they're in their hard times or their difficult moments, that they can rise up above it.
Yep.
You mentioned earlier that your mom stayed in her grief or her victimhood for such a long time. And
Still
maybe
is.
maybe that's part of the gift that you're giving your kids, to know there's a way out.
For sure. And, and that was the other side of that too was I still saw all these years, I still saw so much pain with law enforcement family, people that knew him, people that worked with him, people who, trained with him or whatever. There was still so much anger and so much rage and so much pain attached that I thought that if I write this book and they read it and they see that I have been able to heal from it, that maybe in some small way they would be able to heal as well. And beyond that, I thought to myself, it was terrifying to write this book in the beginning because I knew that in telling my truth and being as honest and authentic and vulnerable as I was in this book, and you read it, so I am all out there and there's no holding back. And I knew there were three things that I was terrified about. One of them was that I knew that this, in telling my truth, I would have to tell my mother's truth. And so that would either completely fracture the rest of what was left of our relationship, or it was going to open a line of communication with us. And it ended up doing the first, she decided that was it. She was no longer going to talk to me after the book came out. And I was okay with that, right? I was okay with that. The second issue I had was I talk about my husband, who was that 19-year-old boy that was with me from the beginning. And we've gone through some stuff in our lives and together. And I thought, oh gosh, is this going to destroy what we have right now? And the third was obviously my safety. And because some of the men were still in prison and I still had that little bit of fear that there would be some retaliation for me being out in the open and talking about this. But every time I had that fear, I just pushed through it by focusing on my purpose. My purpose was to help people have hope. And my message of hope and healing and, I've gone through this terrible thing and everybody goes through terrible things and you can rise up from it.
And
but you have to make that choice.
And it required truth.
It did.
Right? It required truth because if you really want to build a path to help people get better, you can't lie to them about the obstacles and the rocks and the
I am the first person to tell you healing, doing the work that you need to do to heal yourself is hard. It sucks. There are days where you're like, oh, but when you do heal, when you do move through that pain, the freedom from it holding over your life is precious. Like it is a feeling like no other. And that's what I want for people. I want them to be able to feel like that. And I want them to be able to have the life that they dream of and not have whatever it is, the pain that was attached to it, holding them back from their dreams, their dream job, their dream relationship, their dream, relationship with their children, whatever it is for you. And that's why I wrote the book. And that's why I'm out here speaking, and I'm speaking on stages, and I'm doing everything I can to get this message out.
If you had a magic wand, I'll give you more than one wish. I'll give you like 3.
Yeah, okay.
But you can do whatever you want. But if you had this magic wand, like what are sort of like your hopes, and what do you sort of like dream for people who are like suffering with trauma?
Oh my gosh. Well, I think for me, my hope is that people realize within themselves how extraordinary they are and how resilient they can be. And I think it's really important to make you the priority in your life.
You remind me by saying that of this brilliant psychiatrist I once worked with. His name is Mehul Mankad, and he's just absolutely brilliant. And one of the things that he studied was PTSD. That was like a research area. He was a clinician and a researcher. Did a lot of work with Veterans Administration, the Army, other folks like that. And he said, the amazing thing about studying PTSD, the most amazing thing was not that so many people had PTSD. It was how resilient the human mind and human beings are. And I just thought that was powerful.
Absolutely. We are powerful beings. However, we all suffer from different, shadows, whatever you want to call them, like the things that hold you back in your life from having everything and being the person that you truly want. And I think that is the most important thing about healing, is that I finally was able to let go of the relationship with my mother. I was finally able to say, you know what? I can't be in a toxic relationship anymore. And I would have never gotten there if I hadn't healed from, the trauma. I would never have been able to do that. I would never have been strong enough or brave enough to be able to do that and walk away and know that that was the right decision for me.
Oh, you made me think of something that is so interesting. So Carl Jung, you mentioned that idea of shadow, and I think there's probably some, you can quibble with Jung's theories here or there, but one of the things that he talked about was the shadow, like this idea that from, like, if you talk to someone, and I've seen this both in my clients, employees that I've worked with, friends, that if you ask them what they were like as a child, like when they were a little kid, like a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old, this person who's sitting in front of me who's totally cautious and anxious right now may have been completely mischievous as a child or whatever it was. But something along their journey kind of like beat them out of that, or beat that out of them, or took it away, or diverted it. And one of the things that Jung talks about is our natural inclination is to ignore our shadow
Mm-hmm.
and it walks behind us and it seeps into our life and it does all these things like a terrorist or a stalker
Right.
because it's not going to be ignored.
Yep.
And that his argument is you need to learn to walk beside your shadow, and then you need to learn how to embrace it,
Mhm.
because in embracing it, you find you are accepting yourself. You are
All the
finally
parts
accepting
of
yourself.
yourself.
Yes.
I think it's really important that, in healing, that you understand the different parts of who you were through your healing experience, right? And maybe you made some bad decisions or bad choices or, you know, um, you know, self-sabotaging and things like that. Now, I talk about my mom's drinking, right? And in my book, and my brother, he is a recovering addict. Um, both of them, that's the route that they took to cope with their pain. And I don't blame them, because that's, people deal with pain and trauma differently, right? However, when you start to heal and you realize that that's the reason behind the drinking and the drugging and the whatever it is that you're doing, you're able to really embrace, like, okay, I did that, I made those choices, but that's not who I am now, right? But
Yeah.
it made me who I am right now.
And I am better for it.
And I am better for it. And so, I have this thing that I tell people, this is that in my dad's death, I found my purpose.
Mm.
And in my dad's death, he found his purpose. And because a lot of good came from a tragic event, and people opened their eyes a little bit more. They were more, that not that I agree with it, but some of the training that new officers received after my dad was killed, just opened people's eyes to know, like, you need to be cautious and you need to know, your surroundings. And, there was a lot of different things that came out of his tragedy. But for me, I felt like that too propelled me into where I'm at now, which is speaking my truth and telling my story and encouraging other people to do the same. I feel like when you probably, I don't know if you agree with me with this or not, but I feel like when you've healed from something, it's almost like the next step is to help others.
Absolutely.
And
I
so
mean,
I feel like my
it's
book
the
is like
reason.
a Cliff Notes.
It's
will.
very it's interesting you say that, because if you look at something like the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, what's the last one? It's to be of service.
Mm-hmm.
And that is how you find your purpose out of your suffering. And by helping other people is also a part of your healing.
Right.
I think that's an awesome note to wrap up on. But I wanted to give you a chance, because this is like, to me, your story is so multi-layered, and it would be really easy to look at your story and think that it's sui generis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very few people have a father who's a detective. Very few people have one who is killed in the line of duty.
Mm-hmm.
Very few have one who's assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm getting from what you're saying that you think the lessons in your life and going through these experiences are applicable so much more broadly.
Oh gosh.
So I wanted to just give you a chance that if you have any closing thoughts.
Oh gosh. Everybody's trauma is different, right? Not one is the same as the other. And because of that, everybody's healing is different. There's no one size fits all for everyone.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So, you've got to find what helps you heal and find the professionals that you trust that have that safety for you, that you'll be able to be vulnerable enough to really dive in and do the work that needs to be done.
Yeah. And I do completely agree with you on all of that. Well, Susan, thank you so much for the conversation. I appreciate it and wish you luck in the work that you're doing. And I know you don't need my luck because it sounds like you're already making a lot of progress. And I love that idea that you laid out, that your dad's death, you found your purpose and he found his. Like, you even look at things like the LAPD where they're packed with psychologists right now who
Mm-hmm.
work with people who are part of the force on all sorts of different things. And
Yeah.
I just think that, like, we also sometimes, and that idea you were bringing back, that, like, the bad things are a part of us. I think that it's not Pollyanna to say that great good, some of the greatest good, can come out of the deepest pain.
I have this saying, you've got to have a breakdown to have a breakthrough.
Mm.
And, and that's true. You don't grow without having friction, things in your life, challenges, tragedies, whatever it is, because that's what helps you grow as a person. And because I wrote a book, I'm not done. It's ever evolving, but I feel like every time I get on a stage, every time I do a podcast, every time I have a conversation with somebody where I can give them a safe space to know that, they can heal from whatever it is that they've gone through, and that through that healing, they can have all the things that they've ever wanted, and they can be the person they've always wanted to be. And that's my message.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for joining us for this conversation. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. We've also created a really cool true crime Substack that you can check out. It's called the True Crime Times. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, and to support the podcast, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again soon.